Yesterday, I made a video talking about how Elden Ring solved an issue with community matchmaking that's been around since Dark Souls 2. Today we're going to go back even further, all the way back to 2009 with Demon Souls. So I suppose we can consider this like part 2 on quality of life fixes that address super old problems from the Souls games. And today I'm talking about motion-controlled gestures. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, this only applies to people playing on PlayStation consoles, and I guess also the Nintendo Switch for Dark Souls Remastered. But basically all of the Soulsborne games since Demon Souls have allowed you to do motion-controlled gestures through the PlayStation controllers. If you'd like to know more, I made an entire video about them, which I'll link to below, but I'd like to summarize what was wrong with them, and also talk about how Elden Ring implemented a simple fix without removing them entirely. How they worked is you'd simply hold down the action button, typically the X button, and then wave your controller around. There were basically two things wrong with the motion-controlled inputs. The first is that the stated motions were sometimes incomprehensible, and they could be very difficult to achieve consistently. And the second, and much bigger problem, was that they couldn't be disabled. Now, to elaborate on that first point, some of the motion inputs were actually not that bad. These first 4 that we see in Demon Souls would have been very easy to do consistently if they were the only inputs that were allowed. These gestures were looking for simple acceleration on a specific axis, and didn't worry about any tilt or rotational values. So it wasn't actually that hard to simply raise the controller towards the ceiling, or lower it towards the floor, or move it towards your left or right. It's these other gestures here that, these were a nightmare. Not only were these way more finicky and difficult to perform on purpose, but the fact that they simply existed meant more opportunities to make some subtle mistake that could interfere with one of your attempts at one of the easier gestures. Okay, to be perfectly fair, Wave wasn't too terrible if you got rid of these two from the mix, so I suppose my gesture tier ranking would look something like this. And now to elaborate on the second problem, you couldn't turn these off. There was never an option in the menus to disable them, which resulted in a lot of accidental gestures. And when you remember that some of the Souls games didn't let you cancel these animations, this means you have to sit through the whole thing. That's not good. Now, I personally never had much of an issue with it, but this isn't meant to be like some kind of humble brag. I think I just lucked into being predisposed to freeze up during stressful moments, so I'm less likely to get heated up and move the controller around by accident. In other words, I'm basically off to the side in a sort of freeze up and die category in a fight or flight scenario, so I'm not very inclined to pat myself on the back here. But just because it wasn't much of a problem for me personally, doesn't mean that it hasn't been a significant annoyance for a lot of players. There's no shortage of complaints about accidental deaths caused by triggering a gesture, and people have been asking for a way to disable them for years. Now, I made that video before the Demon Souls remake came out, and I was a little disappointed that instead of implementing any fixes that I suggested, they just removed the feature entirely. So I wasn't sure what to expect for Elden Ring. I mean, obviously it's From Software at the helm again, and not Bluepoint, but given all the years of complaints and non-PlayStation platforms not using the feature at all, I wasn't going to be surprised if it was finally axed. But I come bearing good news. They are back in Elden Ring, but we can now disable them. And it's better than simply having a global option that just outright turns them all off. Instead, they're now mappable, and it's entirely up to you if anything gets mapped to any of the motion-controlled inputs at all. One of my suggested fixes in my Demon Souls Dissected video was to only use the aforementioned decent inputs. Elden Ring didn't quite go that far, and I can see that they still have some of the awkward ones in here. Well, I didn't get to do enough testing to be sure if these two are tilt-based actions, or if they're the equivalent of simply raising or lowering the controller. So I'm not sure where these ones land just yet. But yeah, these two over here can be pretty awkward, and they're among the ones that I wanted to see removed. But since we can map them however we want, I really don't mind them being here anymore. Something I got to do when testing the gestures in Demon Souls Debug was disable the inputs that I didn't like. This made it all the more easier to do the simpler gestures even more consistently. So by leaving the sketchier motion inputs blank, I trust that I can slot my favorites into these two spots at least, and I shouldn't have any trouble performing them. So, yeah, now you can just get rid of all of them if you don't want them. Or if you're like me, you're just going to use the handful of motions that aren't a confusing mess, and now you'll be able to perform them with a lot more confidence. One small difference is that the action button in Elden Ring is now triangle, because X is now the jump button, So now you're going to be holding down triangle instead of X to do these gesture motion inputs. And they did make one small mistake with the gesture interface that I think some players might find a touch annoying. Unless I missed something, the only equivalent to triggering a gesture with a button press, instead of motion controls, is to open up the main menu and then click on one of the gestures over here. But if they're over here, that means they're already mapped to a motion-based gesture if you're playing on the PlayStation. So if you prefer to leave these motions toggled off, you could go one menu deeper, highlight the gesture you want, and then use the Test Now button to perform them. So this does mean having to go one layer of menus deeper than previous Souls games, if you don't want any motion inputs mapped at all. Not everyone is going to be happy with every aspect of how it's been implemented, but it still certainly beats not being able to turn them off at all like before. And again, for someone who actually liked using the non-terrible inputs, I can see how this is easily their best implementation of the motion controls yet. So yeah, that's pretty much it. If you enjoyed this video, please consider doing all the usual stuff that helps, and I'll also link to my Patreon below. And special thanks to everyone who allowed me to use their footage once again. Thanks again for watching.